Dr. Ameenah Gurib-Fakim is a Mauritian politician and biodiversity scientist and the founder of the Centre for Phytotherapy Research. She served as the 6th President of Mauritius from 2015 to 2018.
Ameenah Gurib-Fakim is a biodiversity scientist, an entrepreneur, and most famously, the first female President of Mauritius. She joins us today from Mauritius for the summit. It's wonderful to have you here talking to us, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Renuka. Good to see you as well.
I remember I first met you at the State House in Mauritius. I think this was in 2017 when you were the president, and we talked about an equitable world. We talked about sustainable development. We talked about gender issues, about women in science. But a lot of these issues still remain, unfortunately, even today. And now we have a planet-ravaging pandemic. How do you think COVID-19 has had an unfair impact on women and girls in particular around the world?
Thank you again, Renuka, and thank you for addressing this very critical issue of how the COVID has impacted, especially the women folk. And here I have a special thought for our continent, of course, Africa, and where women, they make up about 80% of the informal sector in terms of jobs. And we have seen over the past year how these women have lost their businesses and how these women have been so badly, in fact, impacted because the system is such that those women who operate in the formal sector, they are eligible for all the stimulus packages, for all the way the financial system works. And yet I feel that more should have been done to safeguard the jobs, to safeguard the livelihoods, to safeguard the businesses of these women operating in the informal sector. And I think we have lessons to take from this scenario. And the other scenario I also have is for women professionals, scientists, for example, who have to operate from home. And many of these women have to cope with the family. Of course, the husband and the children are at home. And in some instances, they've had to cope with abusive partners. And so I think here, many women, have lost their jobs and they will not be able to play catch up when the system goes back to normal. So having said this, with all the challenges I've just highlighted, I think there are also some green shoots that we have to discuss, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to discuss on these green shoots which have emerged post, of course, the pandemic. And I think countries and regions must pick up on these so that we can build on these negatives that the COVID has left us or leaving us with.
Rightly said, ma'am. We even had a discussion at the summit on the isolation economy and the double shift for women. So it has been quite unfair on the women, so to speak. But under these circumstances, what do you propose of the with COVID and the post-COVID measures that can be adopted to make things better? I mean, are we in the midst of a further deepening gender pandemic, you think? What are the policymakers thinking?
Well, I think while we are hopefully ebbing out of the COVID now that the vaccines are here, and of course some countries are gradually opening up, I think what the pandemic has shown us, there's one thing that became very obvious, at least in my country, is how the e-services have been of such great help. And we have seen green shoots there because these women entrepreneurs who, for example, were able to operate out of the kitchen. They were business women, they were entrepreneurs. They could make the best of the electronic delivery system. So it of course, it goes without saying that investment must be made in these sectors, for example. But there are many other sectors where, we have been talking a lot about the gig economy before the pandemic. We have been talking about the fourth industrial revolution. But I think another layer has been added here in the COVID, of course, post the COVID, is how we need to make women become even more entrepreneurial. And here I have one sector, because we saw how access to food was an issue, and we saw how women feed Africa, and women are already there in that sector. So I think it calls for more empowerment. It calls for a change in the legislation, so that these women can become even more emancipated in the business they do so well, at least in the ag sector. And if you look at the other sector, the technologies that I've just mentioned, And of course, the healthcare sectors, women have been there, are the frontliners. Many of them were women. 70% of the frontliners were women. But where, again, there are shortcomings and where there are drawbacks is that many of these women, they are not at the level of policymaking. And I think this is where we have to, again, keep on ringing the bells that something has to be done. We need to get more women out there to shape the policies, if only for the frontline sectors. But of course, there are many other sectors where we need women to be in the power position to be able to influence policy.
I mean, what are the lessons learned? I mean, are we ready to face another outbreak, another pandemic? As a woman of science, do you think COVID-19 is the start of a global health awareness program?
There are two parts to your question. First of all, are we ready for another pandemic? No, we're not. We have seen all the drawbacks in the course of the past year, how our health system is so bad in some parts of Africa. So this calls for massive investment. It calls for massive investment, not just infrastructure, but also in the human capital. And we have seen, of course, over the past years, how many of the best brains have left the continent. So it calls for a rethink. It calls for us being much more pragmatic in addressing these two issues. Are we ready to face another? Is this the last of the pandemic? No, we're not. We're not out of the woods yet, because we have seen, at least this is what's being said, that the pandemic started when the virus jumped from the wildlife in Wuhan onto human beings. And the way we have based our economies, the way we have been destructive of the environment, I don't think we've seen the last of it. I think we are getting closer to wildlife, so we should be able to expect more of such pandemics. But there is one bigger pandemic which is looming, and we have played ostrich for far too long, and I think it's time to look at it, right in the eye, is climate change. And I think by the time we start really addressing climate change, it's going to make the COVID look like child's play. So we have to get our act together. We have to put our money where our mouth is, and more importantly, look at all the issues which are facing us and which are going to hit us. And I think Africa has already borne the brunt of it, at least over the past 2 years, because we have seen crops failing out in Zimbabwe, for example. We have seen the El Nino impacting the east coast of Africa with flooding, while on the other side of the continent, Australia was burning. So all these are symptomatic issues that we have to deal with, and the symptoms are telling, and unfortunately, we are still playing ostrich.
So you mentioned climate change. I mean, you've always pushed for science, technology and innovation as tools for climate change and in furthering Africa's development. But yet in building resilient, strong, knowledge-based economies, I mean, you need the other half of the population, and there's always this perception that girls can't do science, they can't be policymakers, women can't be policymakers. How do you see that? Is there a shift happening at all that you see on the continent?
If we don't shift, that's as a matter of a statement I'm going to make, if we don't shift our mindset, we stand to lose big time. And I think we will not win the battle against climate change until and unless we draw from 100% of our talent, and that includes men and women. And as you know, 52% of the population in Africa, they are women. We know women are at the forefront of many issues, be it in terms of, as I said earlier on, agriculture, food security. We look at water issues, we look at energy issues. All these women are impacted directly. So if we don't empower the women, we will not be able to deliver on the promises that nations made in September 2015 when they signed the pledge and they signed, of course, the climate deal in Paris in 2015 to leave no one behind. So if we are going to leave no one behind, we're going to have to empower our men folk and our women folk, especially girls, because what the damage is done is when we keep on telling the girls that she can't do science and science is for boys. So the damage is done at that tender age. So it's up to all of us to take a girl by the hand and tell her that she's capable of doing anything. I think this is the message that should resonate as we celebrate women on the 8th of March. Tell her that she's capable of doing anything because she can.
You've always talked about the youth dividend as well, and the population of sub-Saharan Africa is projected to double by 2050. How do you think economies, the emerging economies of Africa, are invested in the youth, in entrepreneurship, in innovation, in changing the landscape?
We talk about the youth dividend, but I think if we're not careful, this youth dividend can become a bane for the continent. Why do I say this? Because the median age of many countries in Africa is 16 to 18. And we find that the age difference, the age gap between the leaders and the youngest member of the population in Africa is very, very wide. So we're going to have to embrace this. We're going to have to embrace them. We're going to have to give them the tool. We're going to have to create the necessary ecosystem for these young people to emerge, for them to become entrepreneur, for them to be, they are already tech savvy. So what equipment, what resources do we put at their disposal for these young people to actually become job creators and not job seekers? Unfortunately, many of our leaders are in denial. We keep talking about the youth dividend, but we have to be very, very careful, because one youth in Northern Africa created what we know today as the Arab Spring. So we have to be very, very careful of this. But of course, having said this, they present an enormous potential, because these young people with the capabilities, with the talents, they can create many things. They can become, of course, the engine through which Africa will grow. Now that Africa has got a comprehensive free trade agreement that has been, of course, operational since the 1st of January. So the ecosystem is gradually being built, but we're going to have to run faster than we can crawl. And I think the time for action is now.
I'll move from the youth dividend to the blue economy. I know the ocean has a very special place in your heart. And I remember when we met a few years ago, you talked about the rising sea level in Mauritius as being of particular concern to you. How do you think governments, I mean, Africa has a big, very prominent coastal blue economy. How do you think governments are facing this daunting challenge?
Unfortunately, again, I have to say this and I'll state it again. Many governments, many countries, they are still in denial. They don't see the impact of climate change on the ocean. And yet we know that many beaches, for example, even in Mauritius, they are eroding away because of the rising seawaters. And we have seen also the acidification of the oceans, which have resulted in bleaching of our corals, not just in Mauritius, but of course also in Australia, where we saw the Great Barrier Reef being impacted very badly. So I think this is something that we have to grapple with. But, this is not something that we can handle, unfortunately, only at the level of the continent. This is when we need a global approach. And this global approach calls for strong multilateral institutions to operate and work together. We have missed out a few years over the past 4 years, at least, from one major actor on the planet, and we hope that we can play catch up. Now, having said this, when we talk about multilateralism, which multilateralism are we talking about? Because we know the multilateral system has emerged after the Second World War, and it emerged precisely to address peace. And now that we are where we are these organizations that we had created after the Second World War, are they still fit for purpose? Are they still fit for purpose to take on board the emerging tigers, if I may say, the emerging economies, the new players which are coming, the new players who are actually polluting and also who can make a difference in terms of creating solutions? But are these organizations, these multilateral organizations, are they still fit for purpose? Are they tackling, for example, one major issue, one major global issue, which is climate change? So these are questions we have to ask ourselves, and these are questions we have to take up at the United Nations, because it still remains the organization where we take our problems to. So these are things that need to be discussed so that we come up with a system which not only addresses the world problem, but also another major issue for me is the issue of inequality. And this is, to me, is going to impact the world population more so, because we have a system which is not working for all of us. And inequality is perhaps as big as climate change. And where inequality is going to be, revealed and exposed is we have a tool that can do that, the social media. Everybody has access to social media. Everybody has access to what they don't have. And there's nothing worse, there's nothing more corrosive than looking at inequality as we see it now. So we better get back to the table. We better start working. We better start being more inclusive, because as I said earlier on, we will be able to win this battle unless we take on board 100% of our talent.
Climate change, coronavirus, gender inequality, all pressing issues of our time. That was Ameenah Gurib-Fakim, the biodiversity scientist and former president of Mauritius. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us here today.